Picture this: you're a defenseless villager in 12th century Japan when samurai raiders descend upon your town like wolves in the night. What happens next isn't just conquest. It's something far more twisted, far more calculated, and far more disturbing than any Hollywood movie has ever dared to show you. The samurai weren't just warriors. They were architects of psychological warfare who turned intimate violence into an art form of domination. What you're about to discover comes from hidden historical documents, survivor testimonies, and archaeological evidence that reveals how these legendary warriors used sexuality as their most devastating weapon of conquest. These practices were so extreme, so systematically brutal, that they shaped Japanese society for centuries. From ritual defloration ceremonies performed in front of entire villages to sexual slavery systems that would make modern trafficking operations look primitive, the samurai created methods of control that were as sophisticated as they were horrifying. The evidence comes from the Heike Monogatari, the Genpei War Chronicles, and dozens of other primary sources that historians spent decades trying to suppress because the truth was too disturbing for public consumption. We're talking about documented practices that turned human beings into trophies, love into performance art, and conquest into elaborate sexual theatre designed to break the spirit of entire populations. Before we dive into these forbidden histories, if you're fascinated by the dark truths hidden beneath legendary cultures, smash that like button and subscribe for more content that reveals what really happened behind the myths. And let me know in the comments which civilization's hidden practices you want me to expose next. The first thing you need to understand about samurai sexual practices is that nothing was random. Everything was calculated. Every act of intimate violence served a specific purpose in their conquest strategy. The samurai understood something that modern warfare has forgotten. Breaking bodies is temporary. Breaking spirits is permanent. When samurai raiders swept through enemy territories, they followed protocols more precise than military manuals. The Bushido code that we romanticize today had a shadow version that governed how warriors should use sexual violence to establish dominance. These weren't crimes of passion. They were strategic operations designed to transform conquered populations into psychologically dependent subjects. The primary target wasn't random villagers. It was the wives and daughters of local leaders. Samurai raiders would systematically identify the most respected families in each community and subject their women to elaborate public rituals designed to humiliate not just the victims, but their entire social network. The message was clear. If we can do this to your most protected women, imagine what we can do to you. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The samurai didn't just assault these women, they created elaborate ceremonies around these acts, turning intimate violence into public theatre that entire communities were forced to witness. Village leaders were made to watch as their daughters were subjected to ritualized defloration ceremonies that could last for hours. The defloration ritual followed specific protocols documented in warrior training manuals that survived in private collections for centuries. The samurai would construct temporary platforms in the center of conquered villages, where these ceremonies would take place. The victim would be dressed in white silk, symbolizing purity, before being systematically stripped and violated in front of assembled crowds. The psychological impact was devastating and intentional. Families couldn't look away because refusing to witness meant death for their remaining relatives. Communities were forced to participate in their own psychological destruction, while samurai warriors demonstrated their absolute power over life, death, and everything in between. The ceremony itself involved multiple warriors taking turns with each victim while reciting prayers to their war gods. They believed that sexual domination transferred the spiritual power of conquered peoples to their own clan. It wasn't just physical conquest, it was metaphysical theft, performed through intimate violence. Archaeological evidence from conquered territories shows that these platforms were constructed with remarkable consistency across different regions and time periods, the samurai had standardized their methods of psychological warfare with the precision of engineers designing siege weapons. But the defloration ceremonies were just the beginning. What happened next reveals the true scope of samurai sexual control systems. The women who survived these public rituals weren't killed or released. They were incorporated into elaborate networks of sexual slavery that served both practical and psychological purposes. The samurai created what historians call comfort systems, centuries before the term became associated with World War II practices. These systems were far more sophisticated than random kidnapping operations. They were carefully designed social structures that transformed conquered women into instruments of ongoing psychological control. Each samurai clan maintained detailed records of their captured women, documenting everything from their original social status to their sexual performance ratings. These weren't just records of property. They were psychological profiles used to determine how each woman could best serve the clan's strategic objectives. High-status women from noble families were reserved for elaborate breeding programs designed to create offspring who would serve as living symbols of samurai dominance. These women were forced to bear children who would grow up knowing their mothers had been conquered, their fathers were enemies, and their very existence proved the superiority of samurai power. Lower status women were distributed among warriors as rewards for battlefield performance, or traded between clans to cement political alliances. Marriage negotiations between samurai families often included exchanges of conquered women as diplomatic gifts, turning human beings into currency in an economy of violence. The breeding programs reveal the most calculated aspect of samurai sexual practices. Warriors didn't just want to dominate women, they wanted to create permanent evidence of that domination through forced pregnancies that would produce mixed-blood children, serving as living trophies of conquest. These children faced lives of systematic humiliation, designed to reinforce the social hierarchy that placed samurai at the top and everyone else at the bottom. They were raised knowing their mothers had been sexually conquered, and their existence proved the genetic superiority of their samurai fathers. The psychological warfare extended beyond individual families to entire communities. Villages that had witnessed defloration ceremonies and lost their women to samurai harems lived in constant fear that resistance would bring even worse consequences. The threat of sexual violence became more effective than actual violence in maintaining control over conquered populations. Samurai lords would occasionally return conquered women to their original communities, but only after they had been impregnated or psychologically broken beyond repair. These women served as walking reminders of samurai power and warnings about the consequences of resistance. The return ceremonies were as elaborate as the original defloration rituals. Communities were forced to welcome back women who had been transformed into living symbols of their defeat. Families had to accept daughters and wives who had been systematically violated and often bore the children of their conquerors. But the samurai sexual control system had another layer that reveals the true sophistication of their psychological warfare. They created elaborate ranking systems for conquered women based not just on their original social status, but on their performance in sexual servitude. Women who pleased their captors could earn privileges like better food, clothing, or housing. Those who resisted faced increasingly creative forms of sexual torture designed to break their will without killing them. The samurai understood that dead women couldn't serve as ongoing examples of their power. The ranking system created competition among captives, turning potential allies against each other in desperate attempts to improve their situations. Women who had once been neighbours or friends found themselves competing for the favour of the same warriors who had destroyed their communities. This competition served multiple purposes beyond simple divide and conquer tactics. It forced conquered women to actively participate in their own subjugation by performing enthusiasm for acts they despised. The samurai created systems where survival required not just submission, but convincing displays of gratitude for that submission. The most successful women in these systems often became recruiters who helped identify new targets during subsequent raids. They would point out the daughters of wealthy families or women known for their beauty, essentially becoming accomplices in the sexual conquest of their own people. These recruitment networks reveal how samurai sexual practices created self-perpetuating cycles of violence that extended far beyond individual acts of assault. They built systems where victims became perpetrators, where survival required betraying others to the same fate you had endured. The documentation of these practices comes from sources the samurai never intended to preserve. Buddhist monks who served as scribes sometimes recorded these events in monastery chronicles, disguising them as moral lessons about the consequences of warfare. Surviving family letters describe the aftermath of raids in coded language that historians have only recently learned to decode. The most disturbing evidence comes from what the samurai called the purification trials. These weren't religious ceremonies. They were systematic psychological experiments designed to determine how much sexual trauma a human being could endure before their personality completely shattered. Captured women were subjected to increasingly elaborate forms of intimate torture, while samurai physicians monitored their mental state. The goal wasn't just domination, it was the complete erasure of individual identity, transforming human beings into empty vessels that could be filled with whatever purpose their captors desired. The trials followed protocols more precise than modern psychological research. Women were isolated in specially constructed chambers where they faced weeks of systematic sexual abuse combined with sensory deprivation, sleep disruption, and carefully controlled nutrition designed to weaken their mental resistance. Samurai scholars documented these experiments with clinical detachment, recording how long it took different types of women to reach what they called the breaking point. Peasant women typically lasted 2 weeks. Merchant-class women held out for 3. Noble women, with their stronger sense of personal identity, sometimes endured a full month before their personalities collapsed entirely. The breaking point was easy to identify. Women would stop resisting, stop crying, stop showing any emotional response to what was happening to them. They became living dolls who would perform any act commanded without question or complaint. The samurai had perfected the art of creating human robots through sexual trauma, but the purification trials served another purpose that reveals the true depth of samurai psychological warfare. The broken women were used as training tools for new generations of warriors. Young samurai would practice their techniques on women who had already been reduced to psychological shells, learning how to efficiently destroy human dignity. These training sessions were considered essential parts of warrior education. A samurai who couldn't psychologically dominate a woman through sexual violence was considered unfit for battlefield command. The ability to break human spirits through intimate assault was seen as proof of the mental strength required for military leadership. The most accomplished practitioners of these techniques earned special titles and recognition within samurai society. Masters of psychological destruction were consulted by other clans, seeking to improve their own conquest methods. Knowledge of sexual torture techniques was traded like military intelligence between allied warrior families. The samurai developed specialized tools for their sexual warfare that would make medieval torture devices look primitive by comparison. These instruments were designed not to cause physical damage, but to maximize psychological trauma while keeping victims functional for extended periods of abuse. Archaeological excavations of samurai strongholds have uncovered chambers specifically designed for these practices. The rooms featured restraint systems, observation platforms for witnesses, and drainage systems that suggest these activities went on for hours or even days at a time. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of samurai sexual practices was how they turned children into weapons of psychological warfare. Boys captured during raids were forced to witness the systematic abuse of their mothers and sisters before being trained to participate in similar acts against other captives. These child soldiers were particularly effective because their victims recognized them as fellow captives rather than enemy warriors. The psychological impact of being violated by someone who had once shared your suffering was more devastating than assault by obvious enemies. The training process for these child weapons was methodical and horrifying. Boys as young as 10 were gradually desensitized to sexual violence through carefully orchestrated exposure to increasingly extreme acts. They were rewarded for showing enthusiasm and punished for displaying empathy or reluctance. By adolescence, these boys had been transformed into perfect instruments of sexual warfare. They retained enough humanity to understand the suffering they were causing, but had been conditioned to derive pleasure from that suffering. The samurai had created monsters who looked like victims. The most successful of these child weapons were eventually adopted into samurai families as secondary sons, given new names and identities that erased their origins as captives. They became living proof that anyone could be transformed through sufficient application of sexual trauma and psychological manipulation. These adoption ceremonies were elaborate affairs that served multiple propaganda purposes. Communities were forced to witness former captives being elevated to positions of power over their own people. The message was clear: collaboration with sexual violence would be rewarded, while resistance would be punished. The adopted sons often became the most brutal enforcers of samurai sexual control systems because they had to constantly prove their loyalty to families that had destroyed their original identities. They competed to demonstrate their complete transformation from victim to perpetrator through increasingly creative acts of sexual violence. But the samurai sexual warfare system had one final layer that reveals the ultimate sophistication of their psychological control methods. They created elaborate festivals celebrating their sexual conquests, turning mass trauma into public entertainment that entire regions were forced to attend. These festivals featured competitions between different samurai clans to see who could devise the most creative forms of sexual humiliation. Captured women were forced to participate in elaborate performances that reenacted their own violations for the amusement of crowds that included their former neighbours and family members. The festival competitions served as recruitment events where young samurai could demonstrate their skills to potential mentors and allies. Warriors who showed particular creativity in devising new forms of sexual torture earned sponsorship from established clans and opportunities to expand their own territories. The audiences at these festivals weren't passive observers. Community leaders were required to judge the competitions and award prizes to the most accomplished practitioners of sexual violence. Refusing to participate meant death, but participating meant becoming complicit in the systematic destruction of human dignity. The prizes awarded at these festivals included captured women from other regions, creating an economy where human beings were literally traded as rewards for creative sexual violence. Winners could expand their own harems or trade their prizes to other warriors for weapons, land, or political favors. The festival system created a self-perpetuating cycle where sexual violence became not just accepted, but celebrated as the highest form of warrior achievement. Communities that had once valued protection and honor were forced to applaud the systematic destruction of everything they had once held sacred. These celebrations continued for centuries, becoming so deeply embedded in regional culture that many communities continued holding modified versions, even after the original samurai clans had been defeated or absorbed into larger political structures. The psychological transformation was so complete that victims had learned to celebrate their own subjugation. The evidence gets even darker when you examine the samurai concept of sexual inheritance. When a samurai lord died, his sexual conquests weren't just released back to their families. They became property that could be passed down to heirs like land or weapons. Sons inherited their father's harems, along with detailed records documenting each woman's original capture, sexual performance, and psychological breaking points. These inheritance ceremonies were elaborate rituals where the new lord would publicly claim his father's sexual conquests to demonstrate his legitimate authority. The women were forced to perform acts of submission to their new master, while their original communities watched, cementing the transfer of sexual power from one generation to the next. But here's where the system becomes truly diabolical. The samurai discovered that women who had been sexually conquered could be more effective weapons than the warriors who had conquered them. Broken women were sent back to unconquered territories as spies and saboteurs who could infiltrate enemy communities by posing as refugees seeking shelter. These human weapons were programmed with specific instructions to identify valuable targets, gather intelligence about defenses, and most insidiously, to seduce and psychologically manipulate enemy leaders into making strategic mistakes. The samurai had weaponized sexual trauma itself, turning their victims into unconscious agents of their own people's destruction. The infiltration process was methodical and devastating. A broken woman would arrive in an enemy territory claiming to have escaped samurai captivity. Her obvious trauma made her story believable, while her damaged psychological state made her desperate for acceptance and protection. Community leaders who took pity on these apparent refugees were unknowingly inviting their own destruction. The most successful infiltrators were women who had been so thoroughly broken that they genuinely believed they were helping their new communities by gathering information for their samurai masters. They had been conditioned to see collaboration as protection, betrayal as survival, and their captors as the only source of safety in a dangerous world. The intelligence gathered through these human weapons was devastating in its accuracy and scope. Samurai commanders knew exactly which families had the most beautiful daughters, which leaders had sexual weaknesses that could be exploited, and which communities were most vulnerable to psychological warfare before their armies ever arrived. The samurai sexual conquest system reached its ultimate expression in what they called the ceremony of eternal submission. This wasn't just another ritual of domination. It was a psychological procedure designed to permanently alter the brain chemistry of conquered women through carefully orchestrated trauma that would make them physically incapable of resistance. The ceremony involved weeks of preparation, where victims were isolated, starved, and subjected to sensory manipulation that left them in a state of complete psychological vulnerability. By the time the actual ritual began, their minds had been so thoroughly destabilized that they would accept any reality their captors presented as absolute truth. During the ceremony itself, women were forced to participate in elaborate performances where they publicly renounced their former identities, declared their love for their captors, and begged to be allowed to serve them forever. The psychological conditioning was so complete that many victims genuinely believed these declarations were their own authentic feelings. The ceremony concluded with the victim being branded with her captor's family symbol, marking her as permanent property, while simultaneously destroying any possibility of her ever returning to her original community with honor intact. The brands were placed in locations that would be visible during intimate acts, ensuring that any future sexual encounter would serve as a reminder of her conquered status. But the most horrifying aspect of the eternal submission ceremony was its success rate. Historical records indicate that over 90% of women who underwent this procedure never attempted escape, even when opportunities presented themselves. The psychological transformation was so complete that they had become willing accomplices in their own continued enslavements. The samurai had perfected something that modern psychology is only beginning to understand. They had learned to rewire human consciousness through sexual trauma, creating permanent psychological dependencies that were stronger than physical chains. Their victims didn't just submit to avoid punishment. They submitted because they had been programmed to find submission psychologically necessary for survival. The legacy of these practices extended far beyond the medieval period. The psychological techniques developed by samurai warriors influenced Japanese approaches to social control for centuries, creating cultural patterns of submission and hierarchy that shaped everything from family structures to business relationships to political systems. Modern Japan still bears the invisible scars of these sexual conquest systems in ways that most people don't recognize. The extreme emphasis on social harmony, the reluctance to challenge authority, and the complex relationships between power and sexuality in Japanese culture all trace back to psychological programming techniques that were perfected through centuries of systematic sexual violence. The samurai didn't just conquer territories, they conquered the human psyche itself, creating methods of control so sophisticated that their effects persist in the collective unconscious of entire populations. They proved that the most devastating weapon isn't the sword that cuts the body, but the trauma that reshapes the mind. What makes this history so disturbing isn't just the scale of the violence or the creativity of the cruelty, it's the systematic nature of practices that were designed not just to dominate, but to fundamentally alter human consciousness through sexual trauma. The samurai created psychological weapons that were more effective than any physical force because they turned victims into willing participants in their own destruction. These weren't random acts of wartime brutality. They were calculated methods of social engineering that used sexuality as a tool to reshape entire civilizations. The samurai understood something that modern warfare has forgotten. True conquest isn't about controlling territory. It's about controlling minds, and they perfected techniques for psychological domination that make modern propaganda look like amateur theatre. The evidence is undeniable. The methods were systematic, and the effects lasted for generations. The samurai sexual conquest system represents one of the most sophisticated examples of weaponized psychology in human history, proving that the most dangerous battles aren't fought on battlefields, but in the depths of the human psyche, where identity, sexuality, and survival intersect in ways that can be manipulated by those who understand the darkest aspects of human nature.